All right, everybody, it's Chris with Drop Dice. So it is Saturday. Instead of doing Community Saturday, what I decided to do was, because my boss was so kind as to actually inform me that my schedule only kept me at work till 1:30, the day before, and I couldn't plan for BrigadeCon, we decided to do an unofficial BrigadeCon panel here. I've got Chepe Lepepe with me here, and we're going to talk about Asian influences, and looks like Josh has made it as well. And we're going to talk about Asian influences in games and how to run some Oriental adventure stuff. Chepe has a lot of Asian influences in his game, even though they're not quite as inherently as obvious as they are in mine. When you guys see L5R, it's samurai, it's in your face. You know it's an Asian influence game. But let's kind of start with Chepe, and you can kind of tell us your background and how you use some of that stuff, just as kind of a quick overview.
Okay. Exactly how I just kind of splice it in wherever it seems fitting for games. I'm someone who has a great interest in a lot of different kinds of people groups. I love anthropology, and I love how different cultures move from different places, like the southern migration of Hmong over time to southern China, down to Laos and Tibet, and how they settled. I find the representation issues between multiple groups when they're all clustered together a very interesting subject to tackle. Because of my natural nerdiness for the area, I ended up looking up a lot of stuff in Nepal, Bhutan, and also like the area around Gangtok in northern India, and a lot of areas in certain areas of India are primarily where a lot of my influences are, and a bit of Mongolian as well. I was never that big of a fan of traditional samurai or anything like that, which is why my drawing on those things are less obvious. I've done a few like Tibetan-style D&D games. I have a setting that I'm working on now called Shiatma that is very Tibetan and Indian influenced. It's really a butchered bastardization of both of those kind of chubbed together with science fantasy. And I do a lot of those. So yes, so basically it's just occasionally there'll be a country or there'll be a game where I'll take those politics and those worldviews and I'll just kind of put them into the game.
All right, perfect. And Josh, how about you introduce yourself and tell us what you use some of your Asian influence stuff for inside your games.
Hello, I'm Josh, the Smoking RP Gamer. I just got in here, so I'm just getting ready to put up the overlay. But as far as Asian influences, I tend to definitely use Asian influences when I'm playing Asian games like L5R or something like that, because it's, in your face, as Chris said. I have put Asian influences in even European settings by using basically an honor system. And old 2nd edition, if you had the Oriental Adventures Handbook, if you could get past the massive amounts of racism it threw at you, because it did throw a lot at you, it did have an honor system. And even in 3rd edition, I think their Oriental Adventures had an honor system built in.
Yeah, and interestingly that you point out 3rd edition, we'll come back to that one, because there is some fun stuff about Oriental Adventures for 3rd that I'd like to discuss.
Yes, I know, and I will let you discuss that. But essentially, they all have these honor systems built into them, and you can quite easily take those honor systems and even place them inside a more European-centric game. And by taking the honor system, you can build this kind of almost samurai feudal Japan thing, and filling just off an honor system. So that's kind of great that you can do that. That's how I use them, though.
All right, and it looks like Kyle from Legacy Gaming has, or Legacy Game Mastering rather, I always screw that up, has joined us as well. Kyle, if you don't mind introducing yourself and how you kind of use some Asian influences in your game, kind of broad strokes to get us started here.
As Chris said, my name's Kyle. I'm with Legacy Game Mastering. I actually kind of got introed into Asian-themed games with L5R, originally the CCG, but the 1st edition of the RPG. I've used a little bit of their Asian-themed stuff, mostly Karatur and to some extent some Al-Qadim, which is Middle Eastern more than Asian, but does have some Asian influence, or Near East influence. I really enjoy the whole of the Asian concept. She's a poor type cat. But I've really developed a taste for it. I try to use, mostly when I use Asian-themed stuff, I try to use it in context of a specific setting rather than generically. So that's where a lot of my experience with it comes from.
So, to kind of touch upon a point you made there, Kyle, if you could mute yourself with an echo.
Yeah,
All right, there we go. To kind of touch upon a point you made there, when I say Asian-influenced games, I want to make it very clear that I mean the entire continent of Asia. So I do include things like Russia, the Middle East, India, even some of the Polynesian countries. I kind of are more or less influenced by similar cultures, and even like Philippines, things like that. So I mean, like one of my major interests that fits with normal D&D is actually Russian folklore, and a lot of that folklore focuses on the tundra of Russia, which is further in and more towards the Asian side. And I like things like Baba Yaga and all that other stuff. So adding to that and having the complexity, I think one of the strengths that Asian cultures and gaming can actually bring to the table is if you look at the way the stories are done. My biggest draw to them is they're very character-centric rather than world-centric. The world itself doesn't really change a whole lot. It's more the characters that change, and it's their influence upon the world that you see direct interactions. Like the world won't change unless the players make it change, and that's something that really draws me to the kind of storytelling that comes with that. Since we started talking about D&D, I kind of want to point out the bastard child of D&D, the monk, because the monk is interesting. It's labeled after Shaolin monks in theory, but I always thought it was strange that D&D didn't go with more like Gregorian monks and give it kind of more of like a bard kind of feeling. What do you guys have opinions on that? I like the fact that there's a little bit of Asian influence in there, but it almost seems a little out of place. How do you guys feel about that?
Well, I mean, I like the monk as it is, and I think it would have been weird to have like the more traditional European monk, is he mostly makes wine and beer, so like, it'd be really hard to play that in some ways.
Like he's a non-combatant knowledge monkey. That's why I said he would feel kind of like a bard, really.
Yeah, yeah.
The whole monk concept in D&D is a unique concept. The fill they went for is not the fill that I think they got. Too many people play them like they're fighters that just don't use weapons. And the reality is, if you actually read the class description, they actually are kind of knowledge monkeys.
Yeah, they definitely have some flavor stuff in there that leads you to it's an enlightenment.
Yeah, it's in 3X. I want to say they were one of the higher skill ranks per level in 3X. I'd have to recheck that, but I want to say that's true.
Yeah, if I remember right, they've always been kind of a little more than like your standard character. It was definitely more than fighters, regardless of that.
And it certainly didn't help that they got all the ridiculous abilities like being immune to disease and immune to insta-deaths and all the other...
The point where they just stop aging. They look like the same age forever.
Kind of ridiculous abilities, but fun nonetheless.
Yeah, 3.0 monks for like at higher levels were OP as crap.
I like the old 3.0 monk though. Nothing beats Slowfall at high levels. We need to get to the bottom of this 135-foot cliff. Well, see you at the bottom. Kind of thing. And it was kind of ridiculous, but at the same time kind of fun. And people just forget that. They forget that the monk though is he is a bastardization. He is a knowledge monkey. He is a combatant, but he's also got a lot of side abilities that people forget about. Especially if you're talking about 3.x, where you start getting into some of the monk prestige classes. Mm-hmm. Then you get into some real fun stuff. So.
Any opinions, Chepe?
Just in general on the monk, or building off of what was said?
Yeah, either. I mean,
Okay.
it's open for 'em.
The monks are kind of weird. Like you almost wish that they would have had a archetype specifically for martial artists under like fighter that could have been filled, and also have something that's a subcategory under cleric that would fit the role of a friar a little bit better, or maybe a subclass of bard that would fit the role of a friar a little bit better.
Yeah,
Because,
that might not be a bad way to do it. Like one of the like a cleric path, if you will.
Because like that's what they are. It is a bastardization. In 5e, they definitely went for the kung fu feel, like even more. Like they went the whole way of the four elements is basically Avatar: The Last Airbender, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. It's just always weirded me out that like the idea of a monk can mean so much more than just ki, which is really like a specific thing. I mean, you could have martial arts and everything, and it always. The thing that I always hated about monks is the same thing I hate paladins, is that their class ability is that they're just immune to stuff. It's just like, oh yeah, we don't get to, or poisoned, and that cliff, yeah, we jump over it because key point, and we do stuff because we're a monk. Like it's.
I guess to use like a fate term, they do have a lot of like overcome abilities.
Yeah, well, I like the fact that they have that in 5th, that there's at least a cost to it with the key point, because there's at least a limited amount of versatility monks have to choose between combatant abilities and then the super wushu, jump over stuff, climb stuff automatically, dash twice, and freaking close in on an enemy faster than anybody else could possibly can, even more than a caster, unless you're like a warlock. Like I like the fact that there's the judging between the two in 5th. It's the thing that I really hated about earlier versions of the monk, that it is basically I'm just immune to things, and there's nothing that really differentiates me other than the fact that I'm superior at being immune to certain things, and I can do a bunch of attacks.
Now,
in my mind.
Now the opposite of that, of course, is instead of trying to take the monk and westernizing the monk, you can take a look at like the other classes and kind of bring them around. So what I'd like to talk about is one of the things that Josh mentioned was the honor system in the Dungeon Master's Guide. For 5th edition, it's actually really well thought out, and it's funny that you mentioned that you can take the honor system and create a culture that is got a samurai feel. I made the joke to Chepe before that I could completely reskin L5R, take out every bit that says Asian, and instead turn it into a Viking game. I would just have to change a couple words inside there. But Vikings, as another like noble warriors type society, follow a lot of very similar rules. The Vikings have the 9 noble virtues, which is comparable in some ways to the Code of Bushido for samurai, or I forget the name of it, but the warrior caste in India also has its own like credo for its warriors, and it's always been interesting to me that like in a similar way that Christian beliefs and things like that, like that there was a flood that happened, there's also a lot of similarities between warrior cultures no matter where you go, that they all seem to value very, very distinct similar things. And to see that kind of repeated over time means that you can take some of those influences from a culture that may not be 100% to your setting and kind of tweak them just a little bit to fit them inside there. So if you're playing like, you know, a Viking game, for example, but you want to have a character that has kind of more of an Asian like hand axe feel, where he's going for speed rather than damage, and he goes for a lot of movement combat, you can totally ingrain that and it would still fit. Now, what I want to do first is kind of talk about Asian influences in D&D, since that's the more popular one, for a little bit, and then we can start talking about other games and things like that that we've seen and played and things like that. Do you guys have any other suggestions on how to bring over kind of similar themes into your world? I'd like to hear about the Tibet stuff because I really like Tibet. I just know nothing about it as far as lore and culture goes, so I'd like to pass it over to Chepe.
Like it. How do I put it? Like one of the easiest ways, if you're just talking D&D, right? One of the simplest ways you can just add like the spice, the flair, whatever, is to just take the general stories of creatures and apply that to the history of the creatures in your bestiary, or just reskinning the monster to make it different, right? Like the setting of Rowan Gate, one of the things that makes it different is that a lot of the creatures, or the dark fae, or zombies, or anything that you deal with is basically pulled out of Filipino mythology, more or less, or slightly warped version of Filipino mythology. So that's one of the easiest ways. What I did for a game called Thousand Paper Lanterns, they were basically in the precipice of a valley, and I based the cultural situation similar to modern-day Bhutan, but dealing with the encroachment of China to the north. And so you have kind of like the Tengu, which were up north, that acted kind of like a pseudo-imperial China. And then below that is a situation where refugees that were basically flooding in, that were basically Bhutanese into Nepal, weren't properly represented. And you have some Mongol Asian tribes that come in as raiders from ancient times. So just adding that political situation of refugees coming into the valley and having this discourse trying to hide out from the imperial to the north of China gave that Tibetan feel, because that's something that happened in history. I mean, it's repeated several times actually from a few different groups, but like the Hmong travel down south toward Laos.
Yeah, that's definitely a reoccurring theme. The idea of foreign conquerors, like it's happened repeatedly for whatever reason in the real world, where it's a lot of cases of so and so controls so and so for a couple of years or a generation, and there's usually like a big revolt and almost a nationalization of its people, where they come together as a single force. And I think that's a really good element to play up in games too.
Yes. Tibet particularly, it's hard to, because my primary focus is like the Himalayas a lot of the time. It's hard to do there without looking at the Himalayan version of Buddhism. Some of them are a little bit more, like some forms of Buddhism don't really care about the cosmology of Buddhism altogether, right? They're focused so inward that it's not as relevant. Tibetan Buddhism is very embedded in the spiritual culture, like spirits and avoiding desire is all a part of it. You could almost say that there's a lot of religious syncretism going back and forth between Hinduism and Buddhism. Like the mix is a little more blurry there. And so you'll get stronger legends of spirits, like for some reason I'm not remembering a spirit legend, but I remembered there's a legend in Bhutan about how the Takin, which is a creature, if you don't know what it is, it's basically like a goat antelope. It's like if you took a water buffalo, a goat, and a like in an ibex or a moose, and you make them a triangle, and you just stick it right in the middle of the triangle. That's a Takin. And a Takin was the legend behind it is that a creature that a sorcerer came in, like chopped a bunch of animal parts and stuck them together, and a Takin was born. Just trying to bring back to life this combobulation of animals. And go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, we did get a question from Jason Lepel, which is one of my normal viewers for Legend of the Five Rings, so good to see him here. He was saying about elemental monks feeling kind of like Shugenjas. I think they do have a very similar feel, but they kind of lack the scrolls. I think if you wanted to go for something like a Shugenja in 5th edition, I would actually recommend a wizard and taking elemental spells on purpose, which is nice with the book of the Player's Guide for Elemental Evil, because they added a whole bunch of those. And I'm sure if you flavored it with your GM and said, hey, I don't want a spell book, I want to have a bunch of scrolls that are just strapped all over me and I whip out scrolls as I'm casting, most GMs are completely cool with flavor things like that. So if you wanted to bring over kind of a Shugenja feel to 5th, I think Wizard's probably going to be a better fit. Bard might also be an acceptable fit, considering how Shugenja fit into the culture of things, specifically for Legend of the Five Rings. Now, yeah, let's kind of talk about that a little bit more. Josh, do you have any ideas on how explicitly you'd incorporate some Asian themes and things like that, and how getting those inside your game, how it works for you?
Well, whenever I want to incorporate something, I tend to just. Well, I'm a less prep person by nature, as all of you know. So my version of incorporating stuff is a lot like this Season 3 version of Battlestar Galactica, where I throw a dartboard at a wall, and whoever it hits is now a Cylon. So it's a lot more that style of thing, where I take this bit that I want to fit in, and I place it in a slot of the puzzle, and if it doesn't fit, I grab a hammer. So I'm more of a I can make things fit by force, like kind of style guy. And that's not entirely whatever everyone's cup of tea. But if you're wanting something, I mean, if you just think about the way it would fit in your world, just think about how you would like it to fit in your world. And if you need to, make some minor changes or major changes depending on how you want. I agree that a wizard would fit with a Shugenja a little more. But I tend to think of the way of the Four Elements monk more like I think they should all be named Aang. But
the Four Elements monk, going back to that one for a second, I think of it more like a Togashi monk specifically. If you look at the flavor of how it's written in 5th edition, they talk about how those monks tattoo themselves and that they draw their power, or at least they idealize their power through their tattoos. I think that's kind of where I feel the Four Elements monk kind of fits. Now, I'm about to start playing a Four Elements monk soon, so I will let you know if my opinion changes on how they feel, but I think just through pure read-through, that's where they kind of sit, as far as like an L5R comparative. Now, we just had a new guest come in, Ben. Ben, if you don't mind introducing yourself and how you use Asian influences inside your game, just kind of a quick overview introduction.
Hello, I'm Ben. I've been gaming for probably far too long. I've been part of many groups, and I don't really do many videos, but I have been doing gaming for a long enough time to play through several of the games mentioned already. L5R. I've also played in Qin and Feng Shui, and the way I tend to use Asian influences is to be honest, it all depends on the game I'm running. If I'm running something like L5R, I'll probably focus a little more on the actual court setting and the way that the society is built, because that's what really flavors the world, as much as it's the monsters and everything else. But it's the people in it. Whereas if I'm running something like set in an Asian area, I'll always draw from like the themes that are central to that particular area, or the people that make it alive, because that's really what makes Asia what it is. It's the history, it's its tradition, it's everything. There you go. There's a start.
And that's actually a really good takeaway too. Is like if you want to have a feel like when you watch those Asian movies and stuff like that, like the kung fu movies, a lot of the draw to them is more the self-contained story and how it kind of brings itself around, and it's reinforcing its own themes. So that's definitely a good point there. Cheppy, did you have something you'd like to add?
No, not at all. I was kidding in chat.
Okay.
My facetious sense of humor doesn't translate well in chat.
I thought I accidentally talked over you or something there. I just wanted to check. Now, Kyle, do you have anything to add to the idea of what you can do to kind of bring over some Asian themes to 5th edition, since that's kind of the big hot topic for most people?
Honestly, the best way to do it is to go back to the source materials from older editions of games. Even as like radically stupidly racist and stuff as the art for Karatur was, it was actually very well researched, very authentic Chinese Japanese feel. It gets missed so much, and same thing with Al Qadim as well, because we had mentioned using the entirety of the continent, including the Near East.
Mhm.
And both of those worlds, I draw a lot of my inspiration from stuff that's already out there because it just saves me a lot of work, honestly. Anything I don't have to do, I don't want to do. And it's amazing how much is out there to work with if you're willing to do it. L5 does a great job with it. It's a good basis for like the honor systems and things like that. But to bring things into 5th edition, it's really just updating previous editions of work. There's always been Oriental Adventures in D&D. From I think he published the original Oriental Adventures in '79 or '80. And that
Yeah, probably in the 80s. I think it was like mid 80s if I remember.
might have been mid '80s. I know it was a first edition book originally, so it's been a long time since he did that. But I mean, he published the original Oriental Adventures, and then there's always been an Oriental Adventure like backdrop throughout D&D's history, up to and including the Complete Ninja's Handbook, which, strictly speaking, I would love to see somebody do some work to convert the Complete Ninja's Handbook into a workable 5th edition class. But I'm too lazy to do that work right now. I've got too much on my plate, as you guys all know.
So, I mean, we've spent about half the time kind of talking about how Asian influences with D&D. You guys know me and my stance. I'm not a big D&D guy. Like, I started with D&D, but I've branched out. I played a lot more of like other games and things like that. Do you guys have any suggestions as far as like other games that people can try that would be easy to pick up and easy to understand? Let's start with Chepe, because chances are he's going to name all the good ones.
All of the... Okay, sorry, I blacked out for a second. What was the question?
I said other games where you can find Asian influence as like the designer's influence in the game. Like we've mentioned L5R as one of those games. It's like an Asian game where you can get kind of a purist feel.
Okay, so there's a few I could think of. Some good, some not as good. One very interesting.
Let's stick with the ones you find interesting. We won't necessarily say if they're good or bad.
Okay. The ones I find interesting. Something that's very interesting is a game called Tibet, the RPG by Vajra Enterprises, which takes place, basically it's like when China comes in to invade Nepal, what if all their mythology was true and the Chinese had to deal with it? So it's like they had to deal with spirits, they had to deal with monks who actually like ascended and dealt with all kinds of stuff. Like, it's a very interesting premise for a game that actually draws on the themes very well. Some people may or may not like and/or hate the system. I know people have already mentioned Qin. They're going to mention Qin the Warring States. It's a very cool dice mechanic, very wuxia, and nobody does the Warring States, period, and it should be done more often, in all honesty.
Yeah, that's next on my list, because it's got a very interesting stat dice mechanic to it. It's all about balance and focus, and so it's good to see that reinforced mechanically in a game.
Mm-hmm. The game that I kind of prefer, that's specifically for it, because normally I use generic systems whenever I do quote-unquote Asian-themed games, is World of Dew. Although I've been looking for more. World of Dew itself is a game based off of Blood and Honor, which is basically an expansion to Houses of the Blooded, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it is.
And the system itself is particularly for Edo, Japan. So after the Tokugawa shogunate. And that particular area is interesting because it's when you have like the Danish and other people like coming in, the Dutch being in trade, so the ports are still kind of open, the Gaijin are allowed in a bit, and there's all those, like, if you've ever seen Samurai Champloo, that's probably going to be the most recognizable for a bunch of nerds. That's Edo, Japan, like that time period, which is the period that I'm more interested in because it has less of the samurai stuff and more of the cultural acclimation, I guess. It's how Japan's coming out of isolation and dealing with cultural influences upon them, how they've wrestled with guns, how samurai culture may or may not survive this, like, after the shogunate happens, how the old and the new are mixing. And so I find that particular, so you can actually find different phases of Japan in that. Yeah.
Another one that very late in the Rurouni Kenshin period, they start to touch upon that transition point between the dynasties and stuff, and that's
Rurouni Kenshin.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting time because it is them coming to terms with the world around it.
So Tibet, World of Dew, Qin, the Warring States, are all really good ones. I can't think of any right now, and I'll probably remember some later on, and Ben will probably name all of them, and then some. So.
I was going to say we're going to pass it to Ben, because he's the next most likely to name all the good ones.
Off the top of my head, the ones that I know of, that Chepe's mentioned World of Dew. I haven't played it, but I knew of it. Same with Tibet. L5R we all mentioned. Qin's already been mentioned. I've had my experience with Qin was rich and fulfilled, and I ran like nearly a month of it, so I know Qin probably better than I should, but I'd have to go back to it and refresh myself on it. But yeah, the dice mechanic in that is really good. It's also nice to see the mythic China end actually being held up. You've got games like Sengoku, which is set as written post Plains of Sekigahara, Edo, Japan. Good. It's the system's not great, but the wealth of information you can get. It tells you how the class structure's broken down. Tells you, it tells you how etiquette works. Tells you about crime and punishment. Tells you about social strata. If you want to know about some seriously in-depth stuff, I would recommend Sengoku as a system. At least to read all the background, because you can learn so much. I mentioned it in passing, but Feng Shui, which is typically drawn from the Hong Kong action theatre genres, it's kind of Hong Kong action theatre / a little bit of American action hero influence. It gives itself a little bit of cheese just by its own admission, but it's always a fun system to play.
It defined the word mooks, Ben.
Yes, they define the word mooks, but sometimes but that's the style of game it goes for. It very much says you're playing an action movie. If you want to play a game where you kick ass, take names right up until you meet a guy who's got a name, play Feng Shui. If you want something slightly grittier, you've got the whole wealth of games to go in on, which it brings me onto a side topic that may not have been covered, which is about what makes Asian storytelling different to Western storytelling. But that doesn't cover systems, so we'll cover that.
We'll come back to that. I wanted to talk about that kind of in just a minute here. We'll go to Josh, because I know Josh is probably our least experienced, and I probably should have started with him. That way he didn't get cheesed out of the easy ones.
Yeah, L5R. That's like really all I got. So.
Well, you've got that in Qin so far. Yeah, Josh is our newest convert among the cult of Asian games here.
Well, I played Asian games, but I've been D&D centric for so long through like when I first started playing in my formative years. I played L5R without knowing I played L5R. That's how bad it is. Like I played the WotC version,
the 3rd edition rules, yeah,
which apparently is Rukagon, but
it is. It totally is. And that's why I said I kind of wanted to go back to that, because it's funny, because a lot of people that they say that they don't want to try L5R or something. A lot of them did play L5R at one point, more or less, because they played 3rd edition Oriental Adventures. And even 2nd edition was pretty influenced by it too, even though it wasn't directly Rukagon like 3rd edition is. Yeah, I was gonna say, Kyle, you're next.
Interestingly enough, we focused a lot on the modern or ancient history. We haven't mentioned Kuro.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We haven't mentioned any
Not
of the
not very
anime.
well developed as far as a game is concerned, but
That's
very
'cause it's supposed to be
interesting
3 parts.
concept.
Cubicle 7 hasn't released the last 2 parts. Leave them alone. I will defend Cubicle 7 because of the One Ring. Okay.
Never forgive.
Shut up, Pepe.
I was gonna say Cubicle 7 does put out good books. I'm not
do.
knocking that at all.
No. I'll defend them just because of the One Ring. But yeah, you're also not mentioning any of the anime influence games. Bessem, uh, Ninja Burger, which is a comedy anime game. Love of God, there's bukus of them out there. It's a free game, but it's actually well developed. Record of the Lotus War, which uses the fusion system.
Yeah.
There's just bukus of modern and futuristic games that are out there. There's a Cowboy Bebop out there. There's for God's sake, there's a Sailor Moon RPG out there that's actually not terrible for its mechanics. I wouldn't play it because I'm not a Sailor Moon fan, but the mechanics are actually fairly well done. There's just too much out there if you start delving into that. I think there's a system for pretty much every anime ever invented.
There's one that I keep meaning to try. I think it's called Crossfire or Crossfade, something like that.
That one I'm not as familiar with, but I know they did Mecton Zeta,
which is a very good system.
They did all those. Then you did Robotech, you did Macross 2, you did Robotech Shadow, the Shadow War one, the newest one from Palladium. There's a ton of them. People forget that they're out there. Because when you're talking about Asian-themed games, you're thinking, I'm thinking feudal Japan. Those games are still influenced by Asian culture because anime is influenced by Asian culture.
Yeah, and to kind of touch upon that, I was going to say I saved myself for last so that I can kind of pick out some odd ones. One of the ones that I would like to suggest is system generic, or system neutral, I should say. It's called Yoonsoon. It's basically how to make a very South Korean influenced style game as far as the culture and the world is concerned. But it's basically you roll on a bunch of charts and you get some random facts about your world. It's YOON and then hyphen SUIN is what is the title of it. It's also the subscript is the Purple Land, but it pairs very nicely with simpler games like Dungeon World and things like that, where it's like a quick setup, quick play kind of thing. And if you do Dungeon World, there is a set of classes that came out called Far East that range from India to China to Japan even. That one is kind of another one. The one that I always tell people, hey, you're playing an Asian-influenced game, and even though if they tell me that they don't like Asian games, is Shadowrun. Shadowrun is just unbelievable amounts of Japanese like pop culture throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, I can't believe I missed that one.
And then, Cyberpunk 2, because they're basically very similar in vein. And then the other ones that kind of jump out at me, there's a new one that came out called Fragged Empire from a publisher in Australia, and it's a sci-fi adventure, but it's very influenced on popular video game design, which ultimately goes back in its origins to the way that adventure games were originally developed and things like that. So the game itself has kind of the classic tropey feels of an MMO, but developed into more of an actual game. So there's a lot of stuff out there that if you look at it, you can see where origins, things like that come from. And that's going to kind of wrap me around to the differences between like the Asian style of game versus the Western style of game. Now, Chepe's mentioned a couple of them from India, which it would be Dark Yogi, Arrows of Indria. Cthulhu Tech was mentioned. A lot of Cthulhu actually takes influence from Asian ghost stories and things like that. If you want to play like scary ghost stories, you go look up some Chinese myth about ghosts and like vampires and stuff like that, and just introduce them suckers to your campaign and let your players freak out.
I'm surprised nobody has mentioned Serenity as being influenced by Chinese culture.
Mm-hmm. Serenity is another good example. There's a lot of it out there, and I mentioned that I kind of wanted to go more broad strokes. So the other things that I would say is we said Al-Qadim is a good one, but There's also Legend of the Burning Sands, if you like the mechanics of Legend of the Five Rings. Then Dark Yogi, Indria were the other two that we mentioned there. And then there's one that bits of it touch on it. It's actually a Pathfinder game system, or Pathfinder setting called Sunland. It's mainly about Africa, but there is a portion that is kind of dedicated to the caravan drivers of the north, which is kind of like Arabic travelers influenced. And then, of course, if you look at the way games like West March, the style of games that West Marches is, that comes from a very like Eastern Europe, Asian kind of culture, trying to get themselves to better situations and having this refined world where everything is about, you know, what's directly around you matters. The things that are over that mountain aren't important because if we go over that mountain, we might die. So that's another kind of style of game that draws a little bit of influence from it. But yeah, let's go back, and since Ben, you brought up the question of the difference between Western and Eastern storytelling, let's kind of start with you and have you say what you think kind of those major differences are.
I would like to say that the main difference is in how heroes are presented. Generally, in Eastern storytelling, heroes are not necessarily presented as one man fighting for his right. It's one man fighting for his country. It's not so much he or one man fighting for an ideal generally bigger than himself that he can't write. It's never just about vengeance, or if it is about vengeance, it usually ends so horrifically badly you wonder what the point of starting it was in the first place. You see it time and time again. Most cinema has been influenced majorly by the Asian themes, you know, from Yojimbo / Magnificent Seven. You see, you know, you see every action generally in Asian storytelling. You always see the action to reaction and why the world is the way it is. Not every Asian story is a happy ending, and you know, not every Asian story it would be considered by most Westerners a good ending, but it's an ending that essentially, you know, in the Eastern terms, it's like, but the status quo is being maintained. That's a good thing, because the alternative status quo are normally so horrifically bad that it's the ironically normal. The way it was is the better way. Yeah, the bad guy might have won, but the bad guy won for a reason. And I use the term bad guy very clumsily. I will use the term, you know, what most people would recognize as the bad guy isn't necessarily bad. Asian storytelling is pretty much nothing but shades of grey. From what I've seen, there's no, this is good, this is evil. It's, this guy's a dick, but he's a dick for a reason, and this guy's going to stop him because of X, Y, Z, but he's only doing it because that's the better thing for the country. In fact, there's a brilliant section in the back of L5R 4th edition that talks entirely about these themes. And I would quote directly from it, but I can't remember the exact terms. But you see it in the world over you. It's you know, I'll draw on cinema because it's such a good way to see. You know, you see The Last Samurai, which even though it was a Western movie and historically wonderfully inaccurate, people see, oh, it's a terrible ending because everybody dies, but people remember. In Japan, that's probably one of the best endings you're ever going to get. You may have died, but people will always remember.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts about Legend of the Five Rings. There's a specific part that I always remember, which is where my campaign comes from. They say that everybody in Legend of the Five Rings is 3 feet from death, which is the length of a blade. And it's very meant to show you that the world is both lethal, it is in a way uncaring, and it's really up to you to shape it by your own blade. And I think it's funny because I mentioned it earlier that... Sorry about that. Somebody else can talk for a little bit.
I'll grab the torch here. The other thing, Ben, you're talking about how heroes are different. The other big thing that I've noticed with Eastern storytelling versus Western storytelling is the idea of the epic. Western storytelling has morphed over the years to We want short, condensed stories that take short periods of time, and they're not really epic. They're more condensed into short blurbs about your hero. And in Eastern storytelling, the idea is that the story should be epic. The story should be continual, and that history is derived from the epic. That's why almost all across Asia, the best, most remembered stories, anyways, are epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Indian epics, the Epic of the Buddha. You have the Seven Samurai is an epic. The 47 Ronin is an epic. And their stories are always remembered because they're epics, not because they're not like going to continue the themes. It's not like going to watch a movie like Taken, where it takes like 3 days for him to kill like 75 people. They're on an epic quest, and at the end of it, it's often tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of seeped over into Middle Ages Western storytelling, but we've long since forgotten that. I mean, go read, Le Mort d'Arthur, and you see it, but anything past probably about 1400s in Western storytelling, you just don't see it anymore. And you still see it today in Japanese, Chinese storytelling. Look at anime. Most animes are epics.
Yeah. What I was trying to say before my dogs decided that they had something better to say was that one of the things that I really do enjoy about the style of game that you get from Asian storytelling is like you said, is it ultimately comes back around. Yes, you've shaped things. Yes, you've changed things, but in a way, everything is the way it needs to be. It's cosmically focused. It's balanced, and it is the natural way of things. And I think there's something kind of alluring to the idea that the world will ultimately do what is necessary for the world, regardless of what you do, but you can make it a little better while you're there, kind of thing. So I think for me, I think that's part of the charm to those games is being able to see how the players shape their world around them, because it's not going to be the kind of game where you go and conquer hundreds of kingdoms unless you are really trying to do that, and then once that happens, especially in like kind of the way that Asian stories are presented, it's not really the conquering that's important. It's the handling of the government afterward that is actually important for play or for storytelling reasons. And so for me, I think it kind of sits in between both of those answers. Let's shift over to Chepe here.
It's weird, like hearing the blank slates, because you really can't. It's weird using the word Asian because like individual cultures have completely different forms of storytelling. Mm-hmm. Like the Japanese 4-part structure is completely different from an Indian perspective, which an Indian perspective is almost always multi-generational and always kind of is filled with the overtones of reincarnation, of an incarnation going over multiple periods of time, and through the ages the development transpires as a cosmic tragedy or a cosmic romance or a cosmic rivalry goes on between multiple entities as some revelation or something happens over time. Whereas if you do something based in like China, right, the China narrative is all about restoring balance, restoring to the status quo, maintaining it again, because with China, that was their history for a long period of time. Their narrative was the divine cycle. You had an emperor. He was divine because, of course, the god said it was. And then people revolted. And, well, chaos ensued, and there's problems with chaos. The emperor was taken down. Someone else took his place, and the cycle repeated, right? You had that cycle for years and years and years. So a narrative is almost always written to support the person in power, to support the people vying for him, and with Confucianist ideals to kind of like restore balance and to keep your place in the overall status quo of China, because balance was important, because as soon as you broke the balance, revolt happened, the cycle repeats itself over and over again. Whereas India, the caste system you don't really get those narratives. You don't have the restore to status quo thing. All this talk about like how L5R feels, you don't really get that in an Indian narrative. The Indian narrative is very, you do have castes.
I like that Indian narratives, you get stuff like the singular characters don't necessarily matter. It's more like the cosmic level of their actions is what matters in Indian stories. And I think
Yes.
that's a very interesting kind of dichotomy. And you do kind of see that in Western stories, especially when people play D&D. Like, whereas like a cleric is a champion of their god, and what they're doing is ultimately for their god, but it's almost more refined, and it's almost like the overarching theme when you play an Indian style game.
Indian, yes, it's very much you have a role in that worldview, right? In that specific mentality. The caste is more of a purpose rather than a series of confined layers and fences, right? If you think about Japan social structure, you're a spoke in a wheel, exactly. You need to keep the wheel turning. And what you do that makes the wheel turn faster is ultimately what matters. What you do to fulfill your dharma, to ultimately fulfill your purpose, and how you fit in that cosmic wheel and how you fit in that cycle is what matters. So it's more of a purpose. It feels more like a river going through, and you see how the river bends down a mountain. Whereas a Japanese storytelling, especially feudal Japan, feels more like a series of fences and bridges, and the conflicts are interesting when the fences slightly tweak over and there's a property dispute. And it's how the fence is repaired is the majority of the narrative. Because balance has to be restored, everyone has to be put back in their place, because that's how Bushido and that's how the culture works. Whereas China is more about restoring balance. And Tibetan narratives are even interesting altogether, because all of them are about overthrowing invaders, because, well, Tibet has been overthrowing invaders for a very long time, so the majority of their war heroes and the majority of their culture and their legends has to do with either that, or particularly Buddhist mysticism, where it's going through a spiritual journey to where you transcend the need of doing that.
Another one that's kind of similar and interesting is if you look at Korean myth, it's about establishing functional peace with the spiritual world.
Which
like,
is
which is kind of unique to its region, considering.
Mhm.
Korean narratives are a bit weird when you first look at them, and then you look at the way Korea's developed, and you go, no, actually, that makes sense.
Going with the Middle East, I was going to say going with the Middle East, it's about gain is kind of the best way to put it. It's what you can do within your lifetime to better your situation.
Gain or the pursuit of knowledge.
It also varies based on religion and region and cultural understanding. Like the Mesopotamians were about immortality, gaining immortality through knowledge most often. Gilgamesh didn't gain immortality because he was all powerful. He was all knowledgeable. That's how he gained his immortality. Kind of weirdly, but storytelling in that vein, it all boils down to the fact that it really does boil down to the fact that the storytellers weren't trying to tell they weren't always trying to tell a happy story either. That's the other thing. I think we've gotten to a habit in Western storytelling where a story's only good if it ends happily.
I would disagree with that. I mean, because otherwise, why have the punk narratives developed so
Well,
much?
I said generally.
I would say that's changing, but a lot of that is either due to discovery of older texts where it doesn't necessarily end well, or it's just the people who are reading those narratives as a whole kind of realizing that, well, not every story has to end well.
It's also why I use the term generally. Generally, Western storytelling ends happily. Everyone gets along happily. The best stories typically to me end the way that Arthurian legend ends. Lots of people die, everyone's miserable, and then Arthur dies and everyone realizes how happy he made them. And it's kind of like a lesson plan in understanding why people were happy with Arthur as king kind of thing. That your joy is not derived from, and I guess this kind of applies to most Asian stories that I've read, but not all. They don't derive they derive their joy from what they do rather than or who they are rather than what they do, kind of thing. Like reading Edo period Japanese stories, the heroes in those stories don't care what they do. They're happy just because of who they are. And that's another part of storytelling or role playing in an Eastern game like L5R. Your character derives his purpose based on who he is. And it's really awkward for people from a society, especially American society, where we're so focused on what we are. Yeah, that's actually a good way of putting it. Victory through service. But we live in culture now where we focus so much on what we are that it's hard to focus stories on who the person is rather than what. And the Eastern traditions, from especially the Middle East and through China, Korea, Japan, they really do focus a lot on what the person or who the person is, not what. You know, that person is good because they do good deeds, not because they're a certain type of person. You know, it didn't matter if they were a Shinto priest or not. Shinto priest can be just as dirty and corrupt as anyone else.
Mm-hmm. The other culture that I forgot to mention about kind of their unique puzzle piece here is Russia and how Russian tales are told. Russian tales are interesting because they always have a moral, and the moral is never all that good. Like it's always got a heavy consequence to them. And so I think that if you want to get the idea of how a Russian folklore works, it's essentially there is cost, but it's not going to be it's not going to be the ultimate cost. You aren't going to pay your life in most circumstances. Instead, it's going to be a lesson learned, and a bitter lesson at that. Yeah, Baba Yaga is the best example, because if you look at all of her stories, they're ultimately machinations for something greater. She does small lessons to teach the people around her that they should respect the wildlife, that they should respect their culture, that they should clean the waters around them. But when you look at all of these little tiny things that she's done, ultimately what she does is she takes all of those pieces and then turns it around into a giant lesson almost. It's honestly about verbal teaching when it comes to writing kind of a Russian story, and they're almost always gray to dark. That's kind of the tone that Russian stories take. It's hard to have a high myth fantasy Russia and get the right feel.
That's why Usura from 7th Sea is such an amazing thing, because it does such a great job of incorporating that mythology into their world, especially the whole concept of shape changing.
Mm-hmm. That's another kind of interesting thread that goes through a lot of them is the shape changers, and the idea that that the culture and the mythology reinforce the idea that people aren't always what they appear to be, that you should judge a person individually because mythologically there's shapeshifters out there. Almost every one of those cultures has a very deep line of shapeshifter myths. Native Americans actually have a lot of myth similar in kind of design.
Hence the reason the Nagaloshi from the Midwestern tribes called different.
Yeah, I mean, Shepard brings up a good point. There's a ton of cultures that do. I mean, in the way that they're presented in Asian cultures, how the shapeshifters work, that they're not necessarily all evil. Some are beneficial and all this stuff. You see a lot of commonality actually with the way Native American stories go and the way that they're presented, at least in the Far East cultures. Do we have Josh still here?
He walked away for a second. He said BRB.
Okay. Well, we are coming to the close of my little hour here. I wanted to say thank you to everybody that did show up, because this was kind of a spur of the moment thing, and I just wanted to do kind of a constructive panel, because I know that some people come to my channel purely for L5R and want to get their hands on maybe some storytelling that's a little bit different. which is kind of a pride point for me. I like being a little different. So thanks for everybody coming around here, and for our 2 viewers that stuck around here. We'll go down the line, and you guys can promote your stuff, because I know you guys do different games as well, which is what's great about having you on the panel here. We'll start with Ben, who may or may not be considering possibly a wrestling game in the future.
Yeah, probably some point soon. I do wrestling, I do L5R, I do Chin, I do Feng Shui. To be honest, I do a weird eclectic mix of everything. I'm like a pseudo niche Barian. I'll play anything, and I'll pretty much run anything given the time. I don't have a channel, but I do like to put myself out there to at least talk about theory and storytelling and themes, which is why I'm here. Hello.
All right. Chebe, you want to go next?
Triple Pepe, the channel is fun, Drodden. Like it if you do, don't if you don't, doesn't matter. Yeah, you probably haven't heard of it anyway. I play a lot of games. I'm running several Numenera campaigns. I run a lot of science fantasy stuff. Old school, well, not really old school, but I run a lot of surrealism and dream fiction stuff. All the kinds of punks and different variations and combinations thereof. Anything that is niche and wonderful and of different narratives, such as Indian mythology and Native American mythology, which I ran a Native American mythic game today, Edrigor, Dark Tribal Native American Fantasy. Even though really it's kind of like mythic fantasy meets Native American horror.
That's cool.
That makes any sense. Like it can be pretty creepy, because Indians have some really wonderfully creepy entities. So yeah, I've done that. If you like that kind of thing, you can check it out, or hook me up at some point and game with me, because that's kind of the whole point of this, is to game with people online. So.
Yeah. If you guys have been watching the L5R game and you liked how the Bat Village was treated, a lot of that came from the surrealism videos. How I treated the spirit world was with a little bit of pointers from Chepe's videos. I didn't use all of it because I wanted to keep it a little bit more grounded than some of the stuff that he introduced in there. But if you want to have a good guide to how to do spirit realms in a way that is going to make it feel realistic in the sense that a spirit realm should be, I'd definitely check those out, because surrealism is what you're shooting for with that kind of thing. We'll skip over Josh until he gets back here, and then we'll go right to Kyle.
Again, Legacy Game Mastering on YouTube, on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Legacy Game Mastering, and then legacygamemastering.wordpress.com. Feel free to check us out. I haven't had a blog post in a while, mostly because the last time I tried to post one the other day, it would not let me start a new post. It just got hung up, so I can figure out if that's been fixed or not. I am getting ready to run a handful of different games. I do have a Song of Ice and Fire game on tap for next Tuesday. Anyone who wants to learn that system, which is an absolutely awesome system. I also have a 7C game on tap that I'm going to put together and introduce people to that system as well. And then I've got a couple ideas for games I want to put together, but I'm still working on them. I do want to run an Egyptian-themed 5e game, an actual, ancient Egypt. Alternate history, of course, because that's more how I am. I run alternate histories. But overall, I run just about everything. I think on my channel I have like 7 different videos for live play, and I think there's 6 different games in there. So if that tells you anything. Feel free, like I said, feel free to check us out. And as Chepe said, feel free to game with us. We enjoy it.
Okay, Josh, if you want to kind of give your little outro here.
Okay. Once again, I'm Josh, the Smoking RP Gamer. Over on my channel, I run D&D, Fate, and I'm getting ready to do my first L5R game tonight. Y'all have a good night, and God bless.
Yeah, for anybody who wants to catch that L5R game, I will be in attendance, so you guys can catch it on my Facebook. Now, as far as things go, I wanted to get with these guys after the broadcast is over, since I do have my website, and write down some of these games that you guys suggested. That way I can have a blog post full of a bunch of games in case anybody wants to try some that we think are interesting. I use the word interesting, not necessarily good, so keep that in mind, because some of them I think are interesting for what they are, but not a very good game. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in to Drop Dice, and I will see you at the gaming table.